The 60s. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. Buffalo Springfield. Next time, I'll raise dogs. They are more loyal and more excited to see you. Jeanette Black. I was born in Washington, D.C. on August 30th, 1948. For those of you who believe in such things, my birth date makes me a Virgo, the sign of the anal retentive. The sign kind of sucks, really, and I don't know if it has helped or hindered me, but I am sure the stars do more than twinkle. I was raised in Silver Spring, Maryland. Of course, there is no spring there, and I can assure you no one was mining for silver. Its only claim to fame is that it is the largest unincorporated city in America. In other words, we were too lazy to govern ourselves. Our town motto was, "I'd like to vote, but I don't feel like driving." Silver Spring is a suburb of Washington, D.C., and all suburbs are identical. The houses may vary in size and design, but the game is the same. Everyone has the feeling that they are living in a special space, when in fact there is nothing unique about it. Being brought up in suburbia is, therefore, like being born and raised nowhere. It is an oxygenated void. As a result, it prepares you for either depression or space travel. Have you ever heard of the great suburban writer? Well, I promise you never will. I can just imagine how Chapter 3 would begin. So many leaves, so little time. I will buy a leaf blower. Growing up in suburbia, everyone was middle class. Everyone had a lawn and a car. Everyone was white, except for the maids who would arrive once a week to clean up after all of us. It's what I imagine South Africa was like during apartheid. There was a wide variety of white people, though. Italians, Irish, Poles, Russians, Jews, Catholics, WASPs. It may have been sterile, but we all seemed to get along. It was the 50s and America was booming. It was a time when Father actually knew best and there was a sitcom to prove it. Elvis Presley was changing the genetic structure of America's children. There were TV dinners, specially made, I guess, for watching TV. The USSR, however, presented a bit of a problem to the idyllic suburban American lifestyle. It was our sworn enemy, and it was going to bury us. They were evil, really evil, spectacularly evil. So evil, in fact, that if you had ever been a communist, you were tainted for life, or so said Senator Joe McCarthy. Communists apparently walked among us, like aliens, ready to convert us to their heathen ways at any opportunity. The commies were no better than child molesters. I didn't experience that level of paranoia again until I smoked pot. I never quite grasped this concept. My family came from Russia, and if they were any indication of the Soviet mentality, I didn't think we had much to worry about. My grandfather had come to the United States in 1916 and didn't realize he was here until 1967. Worst of all, the Soviets had the atomic bomb, and they were going to use it if they thought it was necessary. The good news was that we also had the A-bomb, and if the Ruskies got out of line, we would blow them all to kingdom come. At school, we kept getting mixed messages about the atom. It was used to create the weapon that blew the shit out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But according to a Disney cartoon, Our Friend the Atom was the best thing since sliced bread. It would, we were instructed, eventually answer any problem with which civilization was presented, including the need for mass annihilation. It was all very confusing to my 7-year-old mind. It was a cartoon. It was really sweet. And it was Walt Disney telling me this, for God's sake. Uncle Walt, the same Walt Disney who had given me Mickey, Donald, Davy Crockett, and my first introduction to entertainment-related marketing. It turns out that Disney produced this nonsense with the help of the U.S. Navy and General Dynamics, the folks who built the nuclear submarine USS Nautilus, which carried nuclear missiles. I didn't know what to think, especially given the fact that we were being shown instructional films on how to protect ourselves in case of nuclear attack. They would show us image after image of A-bomb tests, and even the real deal at Hiroshima, just in case our childlike minds couldn't grasp the devastation caused by these weapons. Other films demonstrated how to protect ourselves in case our neighborhood just happened to take a hit. And living outside Washington, D.C., that was a really good possibility. Even a second grader could tell you that. These films would show a bomb blowing the ever-loving snot out of everything in sight, a fireball of epic proportions that let off a monstrous blast of heat. It turns out, though, according to the powers that be, that all you had to do to protect yourself, if you couldn't find proper underground shelter in time, was duck and cover. That's right, just duck down and cover your head, and you could survive the blast. Yeah, sure, right. Even I knew after watching these films that you might survive, but your face would no doubt melt and your nose would probably end up on your foot. We would even have air raid drills once a month in my school. It was, perhaps, the kindest way for the administration to remind us we could all die at any minute. So all of my little friends and I would hide under our desks to protect ourselves. And all I could think while I was under the desk was, what are these adults who are in charge of me thinking? I am not a goddamn idiot. We are talking about a fireball from hell, and these morons had me hiding under wood. Under kindling, for God's sake. I might as well have been a rump roast in an oven. Looking back, I now know it was at this point in time that I began to regard authority with a jaded eye. I don't know what these people were thinking. Just because they were completely stupid, I was supposed to be stupid too? If that weren't dumb enough, bomb shelters became all the rage. People were building underground cubicles in their backyards where they could hide in case of a nuclear war. There, they could stow food and water and wait for the all-clear signal to sound. It looked good on paper, but the idea of spending weeks in a tiny room with my parents and brother just didn't seem worth the effort. Not to mention the fact that there was also the possibility that those without shelters would try to break into yours. Luckily, my parents had a basement, which saved us the embarrassment of building a shelter. Even though we were told to keep food supplies down there, we didn't. My parents seemed to have the same idea I did. If the bomb were dropped, then the hell with everything. The folks who told us we could protect ourselves from a nuclear attack by hiding under our desks are the same jackasses who just told us that we could protect ourselves from a chemical attack with duct tape. Yeah, if you had enough of it to wrap yourself in, you could suffocate before the chemicals got to you. So underneath the calm and peaceful serenity of the suburbs was a sense of uneasiness that pervaded our lives. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're in an elderly woman's apartment, where there's a scent of roses in the air that just barely masks the smell of death. Even though she may be giving you sweets, you still feel queasy. Also really popular at the time were toy guns. Along with my friends Ed and Stan and a bunch of other kids, I played cowboys and Indians. This was during the Davy Crockett phase of the 50s, when every child who wore a coonskin cap was instantly transformed into an idiot wearing roadkill. We played cowboys and Indians, not as some sort of racist activity. It just made the cap make sense. Besides, there are no Indians in the suburbs. We also played war, which meant we divided up into 2 squads and spent the afternoon killing each other. It was splendid, and it was just as much fun killing your pals as it was when they killed you. It should be noted at this time that not one of us ever had an interest in real guns or ever bought one. Then, when it came to raising kids, my generation didn't allow them to play with guns. That's when things took an abrupt turn for the worse. I certainly wouldn't say there is a connection, and I don't know what changed in our culture, but it is strange that only a few kids play out these war fantasies in their backyards, and yet there seems to be more violence among them. On those Saturdays, when we weren't pretending to protect the world from the Russian onslaught, we attended double features, usually horror films, much to our delight. But they were never as scary as we'd hoped. We were like junkies for fear, always in search of a good scare. But the aliens were never alien enough, and the monsters were never monstrous enough to satisfy our cravings. I don't know what drove us to return week after week, only to go home disappointed. And God knows what we would have done if we were really scared. Our lives were nice, really nice. Maybe that forced us to crave a little of what wasn't nice, to shake us to our roots and make us pee our pants. Nothing, I guess, was scarier than the specter of a mushroom cloud. No matter what they say, D.C., like it or not, is a southern city. It's got an easy, slow feel to it, and there's always a touch of drawl in the air. Maybe things have changed a bit with the influx of a million lobbyists, but back when I was growing up in the area, it was most definitely the South. As intimidating and sterile as some of the government structures may be, there is a serene beauty to the city, provided by the wide expanse between the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol. Even for someone as cynical as I am, the memorials are oddly inspiring. They serve as a reminder of just how far our leaders have strayed from the roots of democracy. I wish members of the federal government would take 5 minutes each day to wander down to the mall and take a look at Lincoln and Jefferson. But maybe those guys were pricks too. I can only imagine what a memorial to Bush or Reagan would be like 100 years from now. For all we know, a whole new generation will be in awe of those idiots. The problem I always found living so close to D.C. as a kid was that the government was always in your face. It could make you crazy. The morons start spouting nonsense, and because you're close by, you just want to drive downtown, find them, and start screaming at them. If I had lived there as an adult, I probably would have lived over a grate near the Capitol building so I could yell at them every day. It doesn't help that there is a new president every 4 to 8 years, because the town goes through a whole sea of change with each newly elected commander-in-chief. Whatever tastes the president brings with him are reflected in a slew of new restaurants and retail stores. The town never holds its own against the president. It's his show, it's his style, it's his town. And Washington has always suffered for it. I have always felt that they should have built a monorail in D.C. rather than a subway. Not that the subway isn't a splendid piece of work, it's just that Washington might have been better served if it could see itself anew. My mother. Jeanette is her name, and she was a teacher. Actually, she wanted to be a biologist. She got her master's, but it turns out that today, her master's is just a few credits shy of being a PhD. She isn't happy about that. Apparently, back in the late 30s and 40s, when it came to education, they weren't kidding around. You actually had to show real knowledge over an extended period of time and number of courses. You can't do that in today's high-speed world. People don't have the patience. Just give me the degree, and let's get on with it. She began her teaching career in an all-black school in the District of Columbia. You see, this was in the early 50s, the heyday of an absolutely shameful segregationist policy called separate but equal. I like to call it separate but equal my ass. Imagine that, in our nation's capital, right in the midst of all those lawmakers. In my youth, it always amazed me how bad the slums were in D.C. They were the worst in America, and they sat right behind the Capitol. Our leadership was confronted daily with this serious problem and never did anything about it. They just walked on by and eventually paid a little lip service from the podium. Nowadays, those slums are gone because of urban renewal. But other slums still exist in D.C. They're just better hidden. The mind reels in the face of such racist nonsense and the stupidity of the leadership that fostered it. With her biology degree, my mother was, of course, teaching high school math. There was a curriculum in place that was supposed to be followed religiously. But my mother, being a gifted and intelligent woman who was ahead of her time, slightly modified the curriculum. She wanted to be sure her kids knew why they were learning math and give them a practical application for a science which those kids didn't seem to have. So she would take them to stores, give them an amount of imaginary money, and ask them to figure out what they could buy with it. This also allowed her the chance to teach them to be intelligent consumers. The powers that be found out what my mother was doing and reprimanded her for going outside the curriculum. She argued that the curriculum was a sealed vacuum unto itself, one that turned the kids off to the subject entirely. Many of these students were not going to end up in college and desperately needed a practical application for math in their environment. The administration told her, do it their way, and she responded by taking the highway. As you can see, by railing against authority, I am hardly breaking new ground in my family. It wasn't until my brother and I were older that she began to teach again. She became a substitute teacher for the county where we lived, which meant she spent a lot of time teaching in my high school. Talk about a potentially inflammatory situation. The last place on earth you want your mother is at your high school, and certainly not as a substitute teacher. Substitute teachers may as well walk into the classroom with targets on their backs. Being the son of one certainly puts a kid in harm's way. Kids have been beaten up with much less provocation, such as wearing green and yellow on Thursday or knowing the answer to a question that no one else did. But I was lucky, make that very lucky. My mother was really good in the classroom, any classroom with any kind of kid. A lot of my fellow students didn't realize I was related to her because they thought if she was my mom, I should have been a whole lot smarter. My mother never had any problems controlling her students because nobody, and I mean nobody, not even the snottiest peckerhead or the biggest thug, could stand up to my mother's sarcasm. It was withering and unrelenting. It came from a place deep within her DNA. Thousands of years of Jewish irritability and humor went into the genetic masterpiece that comprised my mother's snide barbs. She could deliver a line like it was a heat-seeking missile, crushing whatever the problem might be in an instant amid gales of laughter. She left no prisoners. She was legendary. Students actually hoped they would get her as a substitute. After a class of hers, word would spread in the hallway of some off-the-cuff remark she had made to put down whatever wise-ass was dumb enough to try to disrupt her class. The bottom line is, my mother is funny. I mean, seriously funny. Heart-stoppingly, belly-achingly funny. Her humor comes from my grandfather, who was never happy, but was always funny. His three most famous quotes were, "It's a great life. You're born in Russia, and they bury you in New Jersey." At the height of the Vietnam War, he said, "If I knew it was going to be like this here, I would have stayed in Russia." And when the taxmen came to his business in 1967 because he never paid taxes, they said, "You have to pay taxes every year." And he responded, "Really? I didn't know." My mother is cynical like H.L. Mencken. Only while in the classroom, she didn't have the luxury of crafting a line at a typewriter. She had to whip it up in real time, in front of the toughest audience on earth, high school kids. Once, a student in what was the toughest classroom at the time asked why he had to learn whatever subject she happened to be teaching that day. Without missing a beat, she said, "Because when you were pumping my gas at the Sears station, where you've been for 10 years because you didn't get your diploma, I don't want to have to waste any breath saying, 'I told you so.'" When my friends would gather at my house, my mother eventually would get around to her favorite speech, the one where she would tell us that we were never going to be any better off than our parents. That family is a wonderful thing, but ultimately, it's what makes any real change impossible. We would, she would go on, all be compromised into oblivion. It was the kind of conversation that went great with snacks. My mother didn't like to cook when I was growing up, and it showed. The food was scary at times. Vegetables would be hot on the outside and frozen in the middle. Beef was cooked to a point of appalling grayness, and gravy didn't exist. The whole idea of the happy homemaker of the 50s had made nary a dent in my mother. She found the notion preposterous. To her, being happy as a homemaker meant you needed a round of electroshock. She once cooked a meal, however, that was so unforgettable that years later I asked her why she never cooked it again. She said it was because we liked it. There is one thing that can be said for her cooking. It prepared me for industrial cooking, that's for sure. But my mother dished up a sense of humor that has served me in good stead, and that beats a good home-cooked meal anytime. Television. Global Village my ass. As far back as I can remember, we always ate dinner with the television turned to the news with Walter Cronkite. My mother would heap a torrent of abuse on the TV whenever some piece of nonsense irritated her. This got much worse as we moved into the Vietnam War. And since Walter spoke more than my dad, at times I felt maybe he was my father. During my childhood, we went from black and white television to color television. And with the invention of the remote, ADD was no longer just for kids. I think the condition actually began with the invention of the clicker and got worse with the birth of cable. Things went completely over the top when every news channel decided that listening to a human being wasn't enough. So they added the scroll on the bottom and as much other crap as they could possibly fill the screen with. It's like an information salad bar. And like most salad bars, it's not healthy. My father. Boomer sooner, boomer sooner, boomer sooner, OKU. University of Oklahoma's fight song. My father was, and still is, a quiet man. My mother shoots from the hip, but my dad is very thoughtful. He can usually be found with an impish smile on his face, as if he's perpetually watching a dirty movie. Sam was a mechanical engineer. His dad died in the huge influenza epidemic in 1918, when my father was 1 year old. He was raised by my grandmother in New York City, where she had landed at the age of 16 after leaving Russia. And while my father was an only child, he was brought up in a house full of cousins, aunts, and uncles. When it came time to go to college, my father found the cheapest school of engineering as far away from New York as he could get. Culture shock be damned, he went to the University of Oklahoma. I cannot fathom leaving New York City and going to rural Oklahoma, but as an only child, I guess culture shock was easier to deal with than my grandmother. She was a lovely woman, sweet to a fault, but she carried that delightfully subtle guilt of the Jewish mother like a claw hammer. So my father probably went west, like many others, to find himself and get some breathing space. My father loved the theater. My mother liked it too, but he really adored it. It quickly became my love as well. He took me to my first play in New York City when I was about 12, The Golden Fleece, starring Tom Poston, a cast member of The Steve Allen Show. We'd go to 8 or 10 plays a year together, and I became more and more fascinated by the theater. From the best to the worst, it didn't matter to me. We saw The Wayward Stork in the early 60s, a play about a mix-up in a sperm bank and the hijinks that ensued. I'll never forget it. It was one of the worst plays I have ever seen. No one was laughing except for one guy, dead center front row. He was convulsed by every awful joke. I asked, "Who is that guy?" My father replied, as if on cue, "He's the playwright." During World War II, my father wasn't drafted because he worked for the Department of War as a designer of weapons, sea mines to be precise. They look like beach balls with stubs and are used to keep ships from entering the harbor. After the war and his subsequent marriage to my mother, my father tried desperately to get work designing in the private sector, but he had two strikes against him. First, he was Jewish, and anti-Semitism still prevailed among America's manufacturers. Second, most of the country's manufacturing had switched from consumer products to weapons, and my father wanted out of that line of business. Unable to find the kind of work he was looking for, my dad remained a government employee and continued to work on sea mines. As our country slowly began to drift further into the Vietnam War under Johnson, my mom began to work for the Women's Strike for Peace. My dad was not as quick to jump on the anti-war bandwagon as my mother. He picked up the Geneva Accords and actually read it, something I am pretty sure Johnson never did. This document was supposed to be the basis for our going to war, and my father read the whole thing to see if there was some rationale for our being in Southeast Asia. I tried to read it, but got through about 3 pages. It was like reading some sort of psychotic legal contract. When my dad finished going over it, he said there was nothing in it to justify our going to war. A few years later, we mined the North Vietnamese harbor at Haiphong. It deeply upset my father. He was always able to work on sea mines in good conscience, since it was a weapon whose purpose was supposed to be purely defensive. Now they had become offensive weapons in a war that had no real justification. My dad was 53 at the time. I was in college and my brother would be there in a year. He decided to retire at the age of 55, 10 years before he had planned to. It was truly an extraordinary event for a man with a family to give up his income in order to be able to live with his conscience. When your father drops out of the mainstream economy because of his principles and pursues a dream, it profoundly changes the way you look at the society in which you live. I didn't realize all the ramifications of his decision at the time, but it left a lasting impression on me and shaped the way I looked at work and what it meant. I was thrilled because my father was truly a role model for the 60s. He was hip. He was a dropout. And so he retired and began to study the art of stained glass as an apprentice. He created works of his own and then began to study art at the local junior college. He took art courses there for more than 20 years. He became an artist and painted into his mid-80s. When I asked him why he stopped, he said he had run out of ideas. My father called his work hard-edged abstractionism. Don't ask. But if you know the work of Mondrian, who basically painted squares of color, you'll have an idea of what his work looked like. By far, my father's finest work, as far as I'm concerned, was a more realistic piece called Showbiz. It's the only piece for which my father ever wrote a title. When I asked my father what he would really like to do, he said, sit on a bench in Paris, France, and watch the people walk by. My Uncle Julius. The only one in the family with any rhythm. He was our Fred Astaire. Julius was my mother's brother, a truly handsome man who became my role model. He wasn't like my parents. He wasn't married. He didn't seem to want to get married. He got a big kick out of life and truly relished it. He was always dating a different woman. They were always full of life, and they were all stunning. I will never forget a picture he had in his Upper East Side apartment, which was the place to be in the early 60s. It was of him dancing with a beautiful woman. He spent his weekends in places with exotic names like Tanglewood. They don't use this word anymore, but the man was dapper. Having served in World War II, he hated the Vietnam War. These guys are so full of shit, he would say. At 19, he had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, but he'd never talk about it. Julius was among the troops that had marched into and liberated Paris. That's something he would talk about. Paris was good, he would say. Really good. Julius always had a great car, a Jaguar or a Mercedes. We had a Ford Fairlane. There is no comparison. He was an optometrist, and he was cool. How, you ask, can an optometrist be cool? I'm still not sure, but he pulled it off. And if an optometrist could be cool, so could I. I was already halfway there. I was already wearing eyeglasses. Junior high. If there is a hell, it is modeled after junior high. Junior high was a huge transition for me. First, there were breasts. Of all shapes and sizes, as far as the eye could see, lovely, wondrous breasts. Elementary school had not prepared me for breasts. I was overwhelmed. And it didn't help that I had no cool. I was completely devoid of it. Nowadays, being devoid of cool seems to actually make you cool. Back then, it made you square. For a time, I was a square squared. My mother dressed me in irregular clothing, and my pants were always way, way, way too baggy. When I asked why were they so big, my mother, as God is my witness, replied, "Because you have a big crotch." If this was the case, none of the girls in my class ever took note. Maybe because the top button of my shirt was always buttoned, and I wore big tortoiseshell glasses. So I looked like a dump truck in heat. Luckily, I had a friend named Ray who set me straight. One day he pulled me aside and said, "You're a borderline asshole, you know that?" "Just borderline," I replied. "You're salvageable." "Where do I start salvaging? What should I do?" "For starters, unbutton your top button." I did, and I could breathe. Blood rushed to my head. I could feel my cool rising. "That's it?" I asked. "There's more. Stop being so eager to please. You don't have to answer every question a teacher asks." "I don't?" "You are the king of the brown-nosers. It's like you're constantly showing off, and nobody likes a show-off. You're smart. People know that. Stop worrying so much. You'll get good grades." It took some effort, but I found my hand going up less frequently. This was not an earth-shaking moment in my life, but it changed the way I saw things. I began to look less and less for the approval of authority figures. Between this and loosening my top button, I could breathe a little easier. High school. The real world is just like high school, only there are more places to eat. The assassination of President Kennedy was like a huge drug overdose, and by that I mean it changed the reality we were living in. Death is like a drug to the living, in that it alters our perception of life. A public death of such magnitude is overwhelming to the senses and the mind. Everyone seems to remember where they were when Kennedy was shot. I was in the 10th grade, but for the life of me, I can't remember which class. What I do remember is that the speaker on the wall at the front of the classroom, from whence all official pronouncements came, began to crackle with barely audible sentence fragments from a radio broadcast. You could just make out the words Dallas and President. It was all very eerie, as everything that came out of that box was always crystal clear. It was like a transmission from an alien craft. I may not remember my teacher, but I do remember her tears. "The president's been shot." I didn't believe it. It was unthinkable. There are no breakdowns of this magnitude in the suburban way of life. President Kennedy is dead. I shed no tears because this could not possibly be true. My life was set up for safety, tranquility, and peace, and our lives were meant to be as orderly as our lawns. Now that was all over. Nothing, and I do mean nothing, would ever be the same. There was a tear in the universe. My friends and I were merely numb for the next few days. We had no words to describe our feelings because we didn't know what our feelings were. We played a lot of football under gray skies. We watched the interminable footage in black and white. I watched Lee Harvey Oswald get shot again and again and again. They couldn't kill him enough. For the first time in my life, everything was out of control. My television had gone mad. This had been my comfort zone. This is where Father knew best, and they left it to Beaver. What was next? A shootout on American Bandstand? There no longer seemed to be any rhyme or reason to our lives. So we played football. It was a simple distraction, for none of us were equipped to deal with the images that were flickering across our television screens. The bottom had fallen out, and we were lost between adulthood and childhood on a makeshift football field as the sky grew darker and darker. And as my world seemingly began to crumble, my sense of humor began to blossom. The genetically bred cynic that I was began to acquire the joy of the properly placed sarcastic remark. Nothing develops one's sense of the funny more than the hard reality of trauma. It's how we deal with the overwhelming shock. It helps us hide from it, and in a weird way, it's how we heal. Humor is how we find comfort in the totally illogical, for it is the bridge back to the logical. And after trauma, the funny gets a whole lot darker. My sense of humor is how I got through high school, so you could say that President Kennedy's death made me enjoy my time in high school, because after going through that kind of madness, high school was a piece of cake. All of my high school friends had one thing in common. They were very funny people. A few of them had started a cartoon book, drawn from personal experiences and the world that we were living in. These cartoons were at times very filthy, but boy, were they fiercely funny. The book moved into a higher gear when a fellow student of ours, sadly, killed himself. He was to us merely a face in the crowd, as he was new to our school. Suicide was something that none of us could really fathom, and so there was cartoon after cartoon, pondering what brought this young man to such a sad fate. It seemed to my friends that our fellow student was really looking for that perfect orgasm when he died, the kind achieved while one is suffocating. This was a whole new concept to all of us, an alternative to our tawdry attempts, which were certainly not taught in our health class. No doubt any adult who saw these cartoons would be totally appalled and demand that we each seek psychiatric care. As time passed, these cartoons evolved into more and more depraved images. The sicker they got, the funnier we found them. One in particular comes to mind, of Christ on the cross, minions as far as the eye could see. He was smiling and singing a tune while sporting a huge boner and ejaculating on Romans and worshippers alike. It filled 2 full pages and made us scream with laughter. It was sick for sure, and I'll concede that you probably had to be there. This type of nonsense wouldn't be tolerated today. Not after Columbine. We, this group of very intelligent and well-behaved high school students, would be seen as half-crazed, insensitive monsters that are liable to do anything. After all, the casual onlooker would be convinced we obviously had no real value system. But they would be wrong, because we did have a system of values, and it was called finding the funny. When I was in high school, I liked laughing a lot. I wanted to laugh. I began to collect and listen to albums of stand-up comics. There was Bob Newhart, Shelley Berman, George Carlin, and Jonathan Winters. I'd watch Ed Sullivan every week to see the comic he had on. I was obsessed with laughter, and if someone had said I'd end up a comic, I'd have laughed in his or her face. But I think what attracted me to the comic mind was the ability to pick up on the absurd, or, in the case of the brilliant Mr. Winters, to show just how absurd the absurd could be. I'd begun to sense a glitch in the matrix of my life, if you will, and comedians were the first to point me in the direction of just where that glitch might be. My search led me to subscribe to a satiric magazine called The Realist by Paul Krasner. It affected and shaped my young, impressionable mind in ways unimaginable. I cannot for the life of me remember how I stumbled upon the magazine, but it was more precious to me than all the breasts that Playboy could deliver. It was a pathologically dark humor magazine, for which Mr. Krasner was the inspiration, publisher, and primary source. I'll never forget opening one issue, and there, smack dab in the middle of the magazine, was a panorama of all the Disney characters. It was seemingly harmless, but, on closer inspection, you realized every one of them was doing something utterly perverse. Dumbo is taking a dump on Donald Duck. Goofy is screwing Minnie Mouse. Grumpy is shoving it up Dopey's ass. He had taken the Vatican of children's lore and cut it down to size. Disney, I heard, wanted to sue him, but eventually changed its corporate mind. This taught me never to trust anyone who doesn't have a sense of humor. Still, I shrieked. I howled. I couldn't wait to share this newfound treasure with my friends, because that's when I realized their cartoon books weren't insane. They were satire. I promptly became hooked on the way Mr. Krasner saw the world. I read every issue, and I was astounded when he took on the unthinkable, the death of Kennedy. William Manchester had written a bestseller called The Death of a President, and Jackie Kennedy fought the book's publication until certain passages were removed. The Realist claimed to have gotten a hold of those sections and printed them in one of its issues. You have to realize that at this point in time, President Kennedy was still considered a secular figure of almost religious importance. His death was considered sacred. The concept of any type of humor that would directly involve this national nightmare was impossible to fathom. Now, I must warn you, we are about to cross over a line here that will definitely separate a lot of us. There will be those of you who will hear the following and throw this in the trash, while others won't be able to stop listening. We've come to a bridge a lot of you might not want to cross. It's one of the first bridges I crossed that took me to where I am today. I am not doing this to shock anyone, nor am I interested in having young teens flip out. I read this stuff when I was 16. It didn't damage me in the least. If anything, this was my baptism in the healing power of laughter. If my sense of humor had a bar mitzvah, this was it. So here it is, an excerpt from the parts left out of the Kennedy book, written by Paul Krasner. American leaders tend to have schizophrenic approaches toward one another. They want to expose each other's human frailties at the same time that they do not want to remove their fellow emperor's clothes. Bobby Kennedy privately abhors Lyndon Johnson, but publicly calls him great, and I mean that in every sense of the word. Johnson has referred to Bobby as that little shit in private, but continues to laud him for the media. Gore Vidal has no such restraint. On a television program in London, he explained why Jacqueline Kennedy will never relate to Lyndon Johnson. During that tense flight from Dallas to Washington after the assassination, she inadvertently walked in on Johnson as he was standing over the casket of his predecessor and chuckling. This disclosure was the talk of London, but did not reach these shores. Of course, President Johnson is often given to inappropriate responses. Witness the puzzled timing of his smile when he speaks of grave matters. But we also must assume that Mrs. Kennedy had been traumatized that day, and her perception was likely to have been colored by the tragedy. This state of shock must have underlain an incident on Air Force One that this writer conceives to be delirium, but which Mrs. Kennedy insists she actually saw. I'm telling you this for the historical record, she said, so that people 100 years from now will know what I had to go through. She corroborated Gore Vidal's story about Lyndon Johnson, continuing, that man was crouching over the corpse, no longer chuckling, but breathing hard and moving his body rhythmically. At first I thought he must be performing some mysterious symbolic rite he'd learned from Mexicans or Indians as a boy. And then I realized, there's only one way to say this. He was literally fucking my husband in the throat. In the bullet wound in the front of his throat. He reached a climax and dismounted. I froze. The next thing I remember, he was being sworn in as the new president. The following are handwritten marginal notes. 1. Check with Rankin. Did secret autopsies show semen in throat wound? 2. Is this simply necrophilia? Or was LBJ trying to change entry wound from grassy knoll into exit wound from book depository by enlarging it? The glaze lifted from Jacqueline Kennedy's eyes. I don't believe that Lyndon Johnson had anything to do with the conspiracy, but I do know this. My husband taught me about the nuances of power. If Jack were miraculously to come back to life and suddenly appear in front of Johnson, the first thing Johnson would do now is kill him. She smiled sardonically, adding, unless Bobby beat him to it. Now there's an eye-opener for you. A jalapeno for the soul, if you will. And now, more than 40 years after the fact, it still bangs around in my head, much like the bullet supposedly did in the car that fateful day. Imagine my surprise when I read that passage at the age of 16. So much for Camelot. I have never laughed like that before, nor have I very often since. It brought my nervous system to a halt, as if I were hit by a stun gun. My breath was caught in my throat. Then somehow, against all sense of the values and decency instilled in me, I expelled a laugh of epic proportions. It was a laugh full of screaming and tears. It was as if someone were scratching their nails on a blackboard with one hand and tickling me with the other. I knew I shouldn't be laughing, but I was, and it felt good. It unraveled a psychic knot of pain that had been tied up in me ever since that scratchy announcement came over the speaker system in my high school. It shook me to my roots. I had crossed the border into a foreign and forbidden land where I didn't understand the language or the customs, but I felt better there. There are no doubt millions of people who would consider my laughter at this very dirty, absolutely filthy joke my ticket to eternal damnation. Obviously, I'm not one of them. And there isn't much middle ground here. Either Mr. Krasner made you laugh, or he shocked you into utter silence. I can sense some of you thinking, well, that's enough of this nonsense. I have better things to do with my time. And you'd be right, of course, but only for yourself. That's what separates us, and why we find each other so strange. So to you, I say goodbye. As for the few of you left on my somewhat skewed side, let us continue. Being born and raised around the capital of the nation had a rather profound effect on me. My local news was national news. The federal government was always in my face, and everyone around me worked for the government. I even participated in 2 campaigns, which meant I was that kid who handed out the buttons or the boxes of bad fried chicken. And that was all it took for me to realize I wouldn't be running for public office. It was hard enough keeping myself inspired, let alone having to inspire total strangers. Since I was so excellent at handing out crap, I was rewarded with a trip to Atlantic City in 1964 for a visit to the Democratic National Convention. They brought the youth of America in for an afternoon of inspirational speeches, which told us nothing we hadn't heard 1,000 times before. The event left me profoundly depressed about the state of our democracy. The highlight was supposedly shaking hands with the president's daughters, Lucy Baines and Linda Bird Johnson. Wow, I thought, they are even uglier in person. I don't know when it became imperative for the wives of candidates to speak at conventions, but it sure makes the whole thing seem like high school to me. Not that the wife shouldn't speak, but it's never been that important for me to hear what she has to say. What's she going to reveal that we don't already know? Here's a little secret. He's really kind of a prick with low self-esteem. That whole tough guy image is just overcompensation. And in the name of all that is holy, can we keep the kids from opening their yaps? What kind of guy wants to be president so much that he exposes his kids to public ridicule at that level? It's abusive. It turns it all into a very bad pep rally. Can't we all just grow up at some point and be adult about this? We are electing a leader, not casting a television series. I really like him, but that wife of his just won't do for network television. Politics hasn't changed much since high school, except instead of a wife, in high school there was a campaign manager who makes the speech and tells everyone just how great a guy the candidate is. Personally, I got the biggest kick out of writing the speeches for student body elections. Since there really wasn't that much someone could do if elected, it left a lot of room for writing jokes and generally making fun of the whole process. It was an excellent outlet for my growing sense of sarcasm. During my senior year, I helped write most of the speeches for the candidates and their managers. I was writing for people running against each other, and nobody seemed to mind. At the time, it didn't strike any of us as the least bit strange. We just wanted it to be entertaining. And that's a big part of what politics is supposed to be now, only they don't know what fun is, which is one of the many reasons I got tired of it. The way I see it is, if it's not going to be more mature, it should at least be more entertaining. I was chairman of our junior prom committee. Now that's something for the resume. Imagine, I was in charge of a prom and nobody thought I was gay. Well, in truth, we didn't really know there were gays back then. Sure, there was one guy, but we just thought he was strange. My friends and I were by now running the student government, not because we were geniuses, it was mostly because no one else wanted to. And I wanted to run the junior prom to make sure we didn't spend any money on it. I figured the senior prom was what mattered, so we should use the junior prom as a fundraiser. If a girl had been put in charge, she would have wanted the evening to be special and would have spent too much money making sure it was. I was going bare bones on the whole thing. We called it Showboat, God knows why, and gave it a Southern theme. I figured keep the lights low, throw in a little Magnolian moonlight, and voila, a Walmart prom. So I picked up some red brick contact paper and slapped it on the gym seats, and then, with my friend Charlie, went to find something to slap on the bricks. Honeysuckle was in bloom, which seemed perfect, and we brought back pounds of it. Actually, it turned out to be pounds of honeysuckle and poison ivy. A number of my fellow students spent a lot of time leaning against the gym seats and ended up bearing the brunt of my frugality. Lesson number 65. You get what you pay for. I went to both proms with different girls. Each of my dates had started going out with me a few weeks before the prom and broke up with me a few weeks after. Music. When I was 14, I got an Emerson 888 transistor radio for my birthday, and I listened to it at night while I did my homework. As I spun through the stations, I found WABC New York, and hope entered my life. Somehow, in the ether of radio waves, I arrived at the doorstep of the world. There was something wonderful and mysterious that existed outside of the suburbs, or maybe just inside my head, and the music took me to places I had never imagined. There were sounds that could turn me right side up and upside down, and will me with a passion I didn't know I had and a sadness I had never felt. It was music. It was my first drug. It was heaven. There was Dion and the Belmonts, and Buddy Holly, and Elvis Presley, and the Ronettes, and the Shangri-Las. The list was endless. But it all burst open, as is more than well established, when the Beatles came to America and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. They sang, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I will never understand it. I couldn't control myself. I was grinning like a John Edwards. They brought a joyous energy that overwhelmed me. For years, they provided the soundtrack of my life. Even now, I can hear a song of theirs and go back to that time and place. Then came the Rolling Stones, and they were like the flip side of the coin. They were the bad boys. I went to their first American concert, and it was the first rock show I had ever seen. I saw Mick Jagger dance, and I thought, oh my God, she's moving. Still, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Music still provides you with a vision you'll find that changes over time. For instance, let's say you fall in love. Well, every time you hear a particular song, you'll think of the woman you were in love with. The first time you hear it, perhaps you'll see her running through a field of clover. And the second time you hear it, she'll be taking a milk bath with a loofah. What can I say? I happen to think a milk bath is a nice idea, and a loofah makes it a better one. Then, after a few years go by, you have a horrible breakup, and you find yourself sitting in a bar late at night, having that last shot of Jägermeister just to clear your head before you hit the road, and something familiar will come on the jukebox. And despite the fact that she broke up with you a year ago, you'll hear that song again, and you'll still see her in your mind, this time standing on a cliff, being torn apart by coyotes. And that's what music's really all about. That's the wonder of it. That's the joy of it. I was the top male student in my high school, and there were more than 500 students in my graduating class. I'm not telling you this to impress you. It's just that it's an integral part of this next story. Besides, I had become really good at getting good grades, a skill you can learn without learning anything else at the same time. I had successfully learned to play the game. It was my senior year, and I knew I wanted to go to college because I certainly wasn't ready to go out and get a job, and I had no desire to be drafted. I wouldn't have responded very well to taking orders. And besides that, my mother wouldn't even let me be a Boy Scout. I had been a Cub Scout, and when that was over, she said, "You are never putting on another uniform again." Plus, I wasn't too keen on the idea of getting up at the crack of dawn to start shooting things. So I took the SATs, which I did well on, but not great except for math. I knocked that part out of the park. I was really good at math, but I had no use for it. I visited a number of schools, but really hadn't the vaguest idea what I was or should be looking for. I stumbled blindly into a number of places, based on where my friends were going. Unlike many of my friends, however, I was completely clueless as how to make a choice about which college to go to. On the upside, I knew what I didn't want. My father and I drove up to Hamilton College, at the time an all-male school completely isolated in upstate New York. No women. How perfectly hellish, I thought. My father thought it was great, at which point I told him to apply. Granted, we had guidance counselors in our high school, but they didn't really seem to know how to live up to their job titles. We'd have been better off with a Hopi holy man in a mud hut somewhere. For reasons that now escape me, I wanted to be a foreign service officer. Who knows? Maybe I thought it was glamorous, or maybe the idea of travel just appealed to me. I doubt I was really interested in shaping American foreign policy. That sounded too much like work. I soon discovered how many requirements there were to qualify for a job in foreign service, and that's when I decided that I wanted to be a writer, because there were no requirements. All you had to say was, "I am a writer," and you became one. You didn't even have to write anything. You could just sit in a coffee shop with a notebook and stare into space with a slightly bemused look on your face, judging the weight of the world with a jaundiced eye. As you can see, you can be completely full of shit and still be a writer. Okay, maybe that's the one requirement. I also thought it was going to be a great way to meet girls, but it wasn't. Probably because as I was staring into space, I no doubt looked mildly retarded. You see, I wanted to write plays, which in retrospect is a lot harder than learning Mandarin, I think. So I finally applied to Yale, Princeton, Brown, Amherst, Williams, and Georgetown. Let me repeat that. Yale, Princeton, Brown, Amherst, Williams, and Georgetown. Let's continue. I just figured I could go to a good school with a lot of stuff to choose from, and it would all fall into place. I showed my guidance counselor the list of schools I was applying to, and he said they seemed like excellent choices. No kidding. He said I would definitely get into Williams, Amherst, and Georgetown, and went on to say that Brown, Yale, and Princeton would be tougher, but certainly in the range of probability. I was the top male in my class academically. I'd done all sorts of activities. I'd put together the junior prom and the senior trip. I was on our donkey basketball team. If there had been a lacrosse team, I would have been on that too. What he neglected to tell me was that there were tons of us little baby boomers applying to schools, and as a result, competition was fierce. He also failed to mention that my SAT scores weren't as strong as they should be, and that I really had to be sure I got interviewed everywhere to have a fighting chance. Oh well, he was a very busy man. And to be fair, back then applying to colleges hadn't become a full-time job and an industry in and of itself like it is today. I guess thousands of disappointed baby boomers wanted to make sure their kids weren't going to get screwed, not like they did. Anyway, I ripped open the letters I received from each school with eager anticipation, fully expecting to receive nothing but good news. Every school except Georgetown rejected me. I felt like shit. Much like the Olympic athlete who devotes 4 years to training and then ends up just shy of the bronze in 4th place. I felt as if I had failed, that all of this time I put in had truly been for naught. I may not have known where I wanted to go or why, but I sure wanted to get in. I wanted to cross the finish line, and I certainly wanted to bat better than 1 for 6. Sure, I got into Georgetown, but by then I had realized I didn't want to go there anymore. It was too close to my home, and the one thing I had finally realized about college was that I wanted to go to a place where my parents couldn't get to me on weekends. Besides, the only reason I had applied there was because it had a good foreign service school, but I was no longer interested in the foreign service. And all that time around D.C. had killed my taste for working for the government. This is the kind of moment when people will tell you that things happen for a reason. Well, the reason this happened is because I trusted my guidance counselor to give good guidance. He didn't. Sure, he may just have been the instrument fate used to change the course of my life, but that was of no solace. And let's face it, the man screwed up big time. Authority was no longer infallible in my eyes, and the next time I wouldn't be so trusting. My counselor couldn't apologize enough, but that was of no help at all. He set up interviews with dozens of schools that couldn't believe I was still available. Nice, but now I was wary of anyone who really wanted me. How good a school could it be if they were willing to put up with me? Many were small Midwestern colleges, miles from any form of civilization, and the black and white pictures in the school brochures of young co-eds in dowdy pleated skirts did little to pique my interest. The only good news was that by that time I knew what I wanted from a school. It had to have a drama department. You see, that spring we'd had a talent show, and my friends and I had written the book for it, giving the show its through line. I played a talent agent for whom all of the acts performed to see if they could get on the prestigious Ed Sullivan Show. And breaking with the traditional format of, gee, weren't the kids just wonderful? Those Ukrainian folk dances were sure special. I told them they just weren't that good. It made for very good comedy and was a huge success. I was hooked. I didn't think I would ever pursue theater as a career, but I wanted to at least give it a try. So I decided I would spend a year at the University of Maryland and then find a school where I could pursue my dream. The post office. Fuck you, Ben Franklin. Less than 48 hours after graduating high school, I went to work the night shift at the Silver Spring Post Office, from 11 o'clock at night until 8 in the morning. There's a transition for you. I now had a clear understanding of the term culture shock. I may as well have moved from Silver Spring to Bhutan, because the post office is another world, with its own rules, especially on the night shift. Let me put it this way. If the post office didn't already exist, Kafka would have invented it. And working for the post office is exactly how you might envision it, only worse. My job there was quite simple. I would grab the mail sacks that the trucks dropped off like clockwork, dump them out, and then box the letters so that they could be sorted. Contributing to the tedium of it all, the din of the sorting machines would provide an endless soundtrack for the night. And if you listen closely, you could discern the unspoken lyrics. I hate my life. I hate my life. Droning on over and over and over, like a song without end. There was, however, an upside to working at night. It paid a little more money. But there was also a downside. The night shift attracts a certain type of person, to put it diplomatically. For instance, I had a conversation with one of my coworkers on my first night as a government employee that I will never, ever forget. I've desperately tried to forget it, but unfortunately, it is permanently burned into my mind. It went like this. At one point, and don't ask me how we got to this point, there was nothing that led up to it, he asked if I knew what a plate job was. No, I don't, was my reply. He then told me, and there's no reason any of you should know this, no reason I should tell you, except to give you an idea of the world that I had entered. A plate job is when a woman sits over a pane of glass held by a man who is lying down on the floor. She then takes a dump on the glass, preferably when it's positioned over his face. Well, the neurons in my brain just exploded. Huh? Why? Where? How? Are you kidding me? A what, to whom, and why for, and that makes someone happy? Jesus, I was not prepared for this type of nightly conversation. So I responded as any sane 18-year-old would. I excused myself, walked over to a cigarette machine, and bought a pack of cigarettes. I then went outside, lit up, and truly smoked a cigarette for the first time in my life. Okay, I had smoked cigarettes before, but this time I was inhaling, really inhaling, in hopes of choking my mind with smoke in an effort to rid it of the smell of that lady's dump. The worst thing was, I had none of the problems people have when they first start smoking. I liked it. Probably because I was going to need a friend if I was going to be locked up with these psychopaths for the next few months. I smoked half a pack without any noticeable ill effects. I had moved from an idyllic high school life to the third rung of hell, and I responded maturely by finding something that would allow me to kill myself slowly. The plan, however, was not foolproof. I was still alive at the end of the summer. I have never had a worse job. Even when I spent one summer cleaning out a refrigerator for a vending machine company where the smell of sour milk hung in the cold air around me. Or even when I helped build a new blacktop driveway in the heat of the summer sun. Those were cakewalks compared to the post office. The mail never stopped. It never, ever stopped. It came in wave after wave, in gray sacks with the words U.S. Mail printed in bold black letters. It came in letters and boxes of all shapes and sizes. There was always more, never an end in sight. It made me crazy. I didn't have a good night's sleep that summer. I would wake up and my pillows had become gray sacks, and I had to beat them with my fists to turn them back into pillows. I began to wish that a mail truck would wreck so that there would be an end to this madness. Since then, whenever I read of postal employees going ballistic and firing off round after round of ammunition, I fully understand their pain. They just want the mail to stop, even if it takes a few deaths to do it. Horrible, I know, but unless you have stood under those fluorescent lights staring at an endless sea of mail, you will never really comprehend what is going on in their heads. I was lucky. The guys on my watch never took their frustrations out on other human beings. They were rather evolved. They merely shot at the rats in the parking lot. The University of Maryland. The Terrapin was the mascot. Need I say more? I spent my freshman year at the University of Maryland. I was living at home while many of my friends went out of state, bringing back enviable tales of adventure, drugs, and romance. Since I was living with my parents, there was no adventure. There were no drugs to speak of, and any romance was, unfortunately, a decidedly solitary affair. There was, however, weight gain. At least I had that going for me. I was lucky that a few of my friends, Cliff, Lenny, and Don, went to the university with me. Without having them around, I would have completely flipped out. Not a day went by that I didn't dream of killing my high school guidance counselor. I was this close to inspiring the kind of headlines usually reserved for people with 3 names. People like John Wayne Gacy and Mark David Chapman. Student Louis Niles Black sought in gruesome death of counselor. Police find brilliant essay. If we hadn't been born and raised in Maryland, and if we had been immensely talented musicians raised in Liverpool, we would have been the Beatles. Cliff is about as smart as they come. He became one of the guys who helped create the internet. He had a great laugh and a better smile. He would have been George. Lenny was a blue-collar kid with real intelligence, the kind of guy who can cripple you with his wit. He would have been Ringo. And Don was the one who thought before he spoke. He would have been Paul. I would have liked to have been John, but I wasn't really. Maybe that's why we never became the Beatles. We were all living at home, and if we hadn't had one another, we would have killed ourselves. The guys and I spent most of our time in the commuter lounge, sucking on smokes and drinking coffee. When that exotic location proved too mundane, we would try to stave off our ennui in the library, looking up books with titles like Wound Ballistics. We also did doctorate-level research on a variety of genital abnormalities out of boredom. I mostly took classes that I'd already taken in high school. My mission was to get the best grades possible so I could transfer to another, much better school. Here's how bad things had gotten. The highlights of the year were the times we would head to a rock club to listen to a group called the Great Dames. The band consisted of 4 very beautiful, very tall women who would transport me out of my ever-present depression. Sadly, they were nearly the sum total of my sex life. I never had the nerve to speak to any of them. I would just constantly fantasize about our lives together. It's amazing how little it takes to keep a man going. That fall, on the advice of my prom date's mom, like I said, things were really bad. I visited the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My plan was to take a quick look at the school and then go over to Duke University, where I thought I would apply for admission. I walked onto the campus of UNC, however, and that was all it took. It is as close as I had ever been to being in love at first sight. The place was absolutely beautiful. I have never been a big nature person, and having worn glasses most of my life, I have never had much of a visual aesthetic. Still, I was absolutely overwhelmed by how serenely pretty it was. I had found the ideal campus for me. I decided at that moment that this was where I wanted to go to school. I felt like I was home, a wonderful home where my parents didn't live, a home where there was adventure and drugs and sex. Oh, God, I wanted a home filled with sex. I was sure I had found my Xanadu. Europe. Thank God for Europe. Without it, a lot of us wouldn't know where we came from. Between working nights at the post office over the summer and living at home during my first year of college, I was able to put together enough money to spend part of the next summer in Europe. I planned to hitchhike and get laid, and hitchhike and get laid, and get laid, and get laid. Such is the grandiose imagination of fevered youth. So with my friend Cliff, I packed up for a tour of the continent. It was a great time to be young, because you could actually travel for $5 a day. The first stop was London. On our first night there, we managed to stumble onto some sort of a stripper hooker joint. As we wandered aimlessly through Soho, we heard a young woman calling from a doorway. "You boys looking for fun?" Fun? Did she say fun? Absolutely. We were in desperate search of fun. And now we knew there was a God. We followed her down the stairs. She was stunning, an absolute knockout for sure. Well, she was a woman, and she was talking to us. Another woman greeted us and took Cliff to one booth, and my vision of loveliness took me to another. We were now officially dead meat. Together we had enough brains to extricate ourselves before we ran through our meager bankroll. But separated, we were now idiots. According to the woman who took me to the booth, if I bought her enough drinks, I could then watch her strip. And if I had a lot more money, I could take her back to my hotel. "Don't you want to buy me a drink?" she purred, speaking directly to my genitals. My head was swimming. Jesus, I thought, I can't afford this. I'll never make it to Paris at this rate. But of course I said, yes, whatever you want, it's on me. One drink couldn't hurt, and then I would go back to my room and not spend any money for the next 2 days. They brought over a bad bit of the bubbly, and as my genitals sank into a depression, my mind went into a total panic. I was in way over my head. I knew it, and she no doubt knew it too. I began to babble. "You see, we just got over here today, and we really don't know what we are doing, and we really don't have that kind of money needed to really have some fun, and if we have some fun, we'll run through our money and have to go home. We never should have left America. I'm really sorry about this." My first moment with a hooker, and I had a breakdown. She left me there, staring at the empty glasses. I looked over at my friend Cliff. He had 3 glasses on the table. Jesus, I thought, he's going for it. He doesn't care. He won't have enough money to get home. He'll live in London for the rest of his life. Wow, what guts. And then the woman sitting with him got up and left the room. Cliff raced over to me. "Jesus, let's get the hell out of here." We raced back into the London night. He hadn't meant to buy the drinks. It was all a horrible mistake. So much for getting laid. Maybe we'd do better with the hitchhiking. Next, it was on to Paris, where we managed to get separated on the metro. I stepped off the train, but he was stuck. And we didn't have a hotel yet. So for the next few hours, as if we were in a bad slapstick comedy, we kept missing each other. It didn't help that I knew not one word of the French language. Finally, by a stroke of dumb luck, we managed to stumble into each other. By the time we got to the cheapest digs we could find, I had an overwhelming need to use the bathroom. But there wasn't one in the room or on the floor. We had a sink and an apparatus that looked like a toilet without a seat, and that had hot and cold running water and a metal stopper in the drain. We stared at it. What the hell is that, I wondered. The manager came up to assist us in our search for the bathroom, or water closet, or WC, or whatever the hell they called the place where they did their business. Cliff spoke French, but no matter how he put it, the guy just kept pointing to this contraption that looked like a sink that hadn't grown up. "That can't be it," I cried. He said, "That's it." And so Cliff left the room as I squatted over what I would learn later is known as a bidet, a device used to bathe one's genitals. Despite having graduated third in my class, I had to travel all the way to Paris to learn one of life's most important lessons. One doesn't shit in the bidet because one has to clean it up. It's an awful introduction to the city of love. When we left the hotel to sightsee, we passed the open door of a real bathroom on the floor just below ours. And any doubts I'd had about the French disliking us were confirmed. The only thing dumber than shitting in a bidet in Paris is trying to hitchhike out of Paris. That was what we'd figured we'd do. Everyone hitchhikes through Europe, don't they? Well, not us. Cliff and I were like the plague. We walked as far as we could in an oppressive heat before we realized that Paris is really huge and that we weren't going to make it at that rate and would have to take a train to Biarritz and then on to San Sebastian and finally to Pamplona for the running of the bulls, just like Hemingway. We met our friend Ed in San Sebastian, which is an absolutely spectacular spot, especially if you have lived in the suburbs your whole life and have never seen, well, anything. As much as London and Paris were revelations to three kids from Silver Spring, San Sebastian was an extraordinary city with an unparalleled vista and enough drink to last us forever. We actually bought wineskins that the locals filled up with vino. Hungover the next day, we all took the bus to Pamplona, which is definitely not the way Hemingway did it. Pamplona was my Woodstock. I had tried to go to the real Woodstock back in the States, but my mother stopped me as I was walking out the door. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked. "I'm going to Woodstock." "What are you, crazy? We took you to Woodstock when you were a kid. You've already been there, and you didn't like it, and it wasn't even crowded." I almost believed her. Pamplona was bedlam. We wandered the streets with misfits of every nationality, exchanging whatever we were drinking for whatever they were drinking. Everyone was everyone else's best friend. We had nowhere to sleep as every hotel was booked, and we hadn't really thought that one out. So we fell asleep in some all-night coffee spot, only to be awakened by two Spanish couples, dressed in formal wear, who desperately wanted to share some of their magnum of champagne. It was surreal. But if surrealer is actually a word, it would get surrealer just a couple of hours later, when the Catholic Church rolled out a big hoop-de-doo ceremony and blessed all the alcoholics in sight. This was the prelude to the running of the bulls, and in my drunken stupor, I thought I might just give it a go. That is, until I took a good long look at the bulls in the pen and realized they were real bulls that weren't kidding around and didn't seem all that happy about their situation. I quickly decided they didn't need me to run with them. My friend Ed had read more Hemingway than I had, and actually did the deed. It was a move on his part that was simultaneously impressive and stupid. I mean, in the end, The Sun Also Rises is fiction. Do we really know if Hemingway actually ran with the bulls? He sure as hell couldn't have eaten in all the restaurants that have plaques bearing his name. Besides, the guy ended up killing himself. Is that something else one would want to emulate? Cliff and I looked on from the sidelines. Watching a group of drunks racing down the streets of Pamplona in front of a bunch of angry bulls is a vision that borders on madness. Then, the whole gang runs into the bullfighting stadium, where a few bulls with padded horns are let loose, just to put the icing on the cake. No one was gored that day, but a few were whacked around in the corrida like a bunch of rag dolls. The PETA people would have wept. The bullfight season was now open, and let's just say it's a spectator sport that you need to be drunk to enjoy. I'd been studying Spanish in high school and college, but I quickly realized that all you needed to do to really master a language is have a few drinks. That way, you feel that you have an absolute grasp of what you are saying and what is being said to you. I am surprised to this day that I didn't say something to get myself killed. The next morning, we hopped a train to Madrid, and then it was down to the Costa del Sol, and eventually on to Milan, Florence, Pisa, Rome, Naples, and Sicily. Our tiny suburban minds were exploding with the overwhelming sense of history that surrounded us. There is a lot of old shit in Europe, and most of it is worth the price of admission. My personal favorite was the collection of saints' bones at the Vatican, each in their own heavy silver containers. There was also a footprint allegedly made by Christ that we saw along the way in Italy. Apparently, he appeared to Paul somewhere and left his footprint. You've got to love those Catholics. They sure know how to keep a Jew entertained. From Sicily, we hopped a boat to Tunis, Tunisia, to meet up with my friend Ray, whose dad was working for the Agency for International Development. The Israeli 6-day war had started the day before, or was it the 7-day war? Either way, for a war, it was really fast. And we were the only Americans on the boat. I have never felt more like a Jew in my life. I wondered at what point they would discover the heritage Ed and I shared and throw us overboard. By the time we arrived in Tunis, which held the largest Jewish population in the Arab world outside of Israel, we discovered that every Jew had fled. Now, apparently, it was just Ed and I. And since neither of us was very Jewish, we would have denied it had they come around for a head count. We spent most of our time there lounging around at the beach or shopping for trinkets to take home. Feeling obligated to get a feel for the culture, we found ourselves at an Arab music festival a few hours from Tunis. The audience was nothing but guys. Apparently, women have to listen to this stuff at home. 3 hours later, we still had no feel for the culture, and even less interest in Arab music. The highlight was a belly dancer who seemed to really get the guys going through some sort of sexual innuendo that was completely alien to us. I have never seen men get that excited over a woman who had her clothes on. After a few weeks of living like only Americans can in a third world country, and by that I mean living a life with servants and a variety of wondrous foods served 3 times a day, we then took a boat to Marseille before Cliff and I went on to Munich. Among other places, we visited the beer hall where Hitler had worked his magic years before. I was lucky enough to catch a drunken elderly German actually shouting Heil Hitler in the bathroom. And let me tell you, an experience like that makes for one bashful kidney. But that incident wasn't the only reason I found Germany a bit strange. The Germans love to wear uniforms. Everyone seemed to have one. It sure made this Jew a little jumpy. We also visited Dachau. Having watched all those videos as a kid, it just seemed right to see it in person. Man, you wouldn't have known what went on there unless you paid really close attention. It was all rather spiffy, like some delightful holiday camp. The only thing that gave a clue to the horror that occurred there was a sign that read, crematorium. It, mercifully, was closed. We made our way by late-night bus to Berlin, which meant a long drive through East Berlin. Every few hours, the East German police, who couldn't have studied our passports more carefully, stopped us. I kept wondering, what if this is it? They could just drag Cliff and me off the bus and keep us at one of their slave labor camps, and no one would be the wiser. It was dark, and the East German police were creepy even in daylight. But that didn't stop me from visiting East Berlin. Crossing through the menacing wall, I reached the drabbest city I have ever seen. It was as if all possibility of color had been bleached out of the buildings. I have never been to a more depressing place. A few coats of paint alone would have helped. I stayed long enough to go to the Berliner Ensemble, the theater company and stage where Bertolt Brecht worked. Many of you may not know who he is, but he wrote the musical classic Threepenny Opera, featuring the song The Ballad of Mac the Knife. Devote yourself to a life in the theater, and do they remember you? Of course not. They remember that song as being by Bobby Darin. So I stood in the back of the theater and said to myself, so this is where Bertolt Brecht worked. Wow. Okay, pilgrimage over. Time to get back to West Berlin, where the Germans were at least happy. We headed back to Paris and then home. The trip was an experience that has informed the way I look at things. There is a world out there, and people don't look at everything the way we do. For one thing, Europeans didn't divide their land into suburbs. They didn't have the cash, or if they did, they weren't going to waste it that way. Besides, they seem to have better taste than we do. That trip taught me that everyone should get out of the country and see other parts of the world. It's pretty sad that President Bush the Jr. never had the intellectual curiosity to go abroad until he was in office. I still wonder how you can elect the leader of the free world who has never seen the world. For God's sake, the man never even made it to Canada. That's almost impossible. Even drunk on a bet, you can make it to Canada. The University of North Carolina. Duke sucks. Come sophomore year at the University of North Carolina, I had decided I would major in drama. But my plan was to take as many courses in other departments as possible in order to find a real major, one that might lead to a real job in the real world. I took psychology, but it involved too many rats and pigeons. Plus, statistics was a requirement, so the hell with that. I took sociology and a course called, get this, the Negro. And I thought any department that had a course called the Negro was not a department with a subject that I wanted to major in. I had to take some math courses, and I was good at math, but I didn't know what it was good for. I loved English. Reading was the next best thing to music, but an English major was about as real as a drama major. I took education courses, but if I was going to teach theater, then I may as well just take drama. 3 weeks after I arrived at school, the head of the drama department dropped dead, and it left the department in a bit of a shambles. They picked a temporary head of the department from the faculty, and he referred to himself as the temporary head. As a result, as much as he would like to make decisions on a variety of issues, he couldn't, because he was only temporary. He was temporary for the entire time I was there. I thought, and you are going to love this, that I wanted to be a drama critic. I know. How fucked up is that? I thought it was like being a sports writer, only it would be a mental game I'd be watching. I saw theater as a sporting event of the mind, and the actors were like athletes who either performed well or blew it. I also thought that there were a few really great drama critics, but that the rest of them were total pricks who didn't understand that criticism was about helping, not hurting. I guess I thought I would be the Albert Schweitzer of drama critics. But one doesn't go to undergraduate drama school and major in criticism. So I had to find a different area in which to specialize. Well, acting was out. In case I still had any delusions that I might have talent as an actor, there were some terrific actors there who served as a reminder that I was not even in their ballpark. Hell, I wasn't even in the parking lot outside their ballpark. I wasn't going to direct, because that meant you really had to know about acting. Technical theater was out because, well, I am not technical. So that left playwriting. I figured it wasn't fair for a critic not to have worked in the theater at least in some capacity. So I chose that as my specialty. And since I couldn't find anything else that I cared as much about in the giant book of courses, I entered the world of the theater. I also joined a fraternity. That's not a typo. I really did. One of the things about UNC that I didn't realize when I applied was that there were 7 guys to every girl. And let's face it, those odds were not going to work much in my favor. The University of North Carolina at Greensboro, the all-women's campus, had 5,000 women, and the only way I had a shot at meeting them was by joining a fraternity. I figured if I could get them into a confined space, I might have a chance. I joined a non-sectarian fraternity called Pi Lambda Phi and met a terrific group of guys who were totally diverse. Half the house drank, and the other half did drugs, and they would watch each other. It was highly entertaining. There were New York Jews and Southern crackers, and being in the fraternity helped me get my bearings in the brave new world of the South. And believe me, I needed the help, since it was the only time I have ever heard anyone hurling anti-Semitic invectives my way. On more than a few occasions, late on weekend evenings, the guys in a rival frat would stand on their porch and scream at us that we were kikes, even though there were far fewer Jews in the fraternity than Christians. I'll never forget standing there one night with Jim and Jack, both Christians, as these idiots spewed their nonsense. My friends wanted to kick their asses, but I talked them out of it. I have never seen a reason to waste energy on idiots. I just couldn't get over the fact that that kind of shit still existed. In truth, I found very little of that kind of idiotic behavior down south, though I do remember being amazed when a blind date said to me, "You're Jewish? I've never met a Jewish fella before." Well, it certainly proved to be a red-letter day for her. Her first real live Jew. Unfortunately, she didn't get to know me as well as I would have liked, and she missed out on the opportunity to see this Jew naked. But for all the prejudice I encountered at school, an extraordinary teacher and mentor by the name of William Geer countered it. He taught a required course called Modern Civilization, and his wisdom was as abundant as his love of life. PBS chose him as one of the great American college professors and filmed a show about him that year. He devoted much of his teaching to clearing our young minds of whatever type of prejudice we harbored and anything else that limited our thinking. He loved to torture his Southern students by comparing the Reverend Billy Graham to Johann Tetzel, one of the chief sellers of the Catholic Church's indulgences. Just being around Professor Geer put my mind on the alert, and he never hesitated to support my endeavors and my outlook on life. I count myself extraordinarily lucky to have met a man like that. He provided an antidote to all the authority figures for whom I had no respect. My roommate at the time was a beefy New Yorker from Pelham named Leon Padula. We lived in a quad of rooms with 2 devout Christians, 2 New York City preppies, and a North Carolina boy who owned the most shoes I had ever seen, and a football player who had quit the team. Shortly thereafter, he quit school to join the Army and went to Vietnam. I returned after Thanksgiving vacation and was met by one of the religious counselors assigned to my dormitory. He told me that Leon was dead. I told him he was crazy. I had just seen him 5 days earlier. It could not be true, except that there are cars and accidents, and he had died in one. I learned 3 lessons from that horrifically sad event. First, there is only today. Tomorrow is an afterthought. Second, your dream is what really counts, so always pursue it with a vengeance. And third, God can be a real prick sometimes. Chapel Hill was an extraordinary place to go to school at that time. The South was still in the throes of the end of segregation and experiencing a huge upheaval. The university was referred to as a liberal bastion, but it was being compared to the rest of the state of North Carolina. There were still signs up like Home of the North Carolina KKK. The university wasn't paying a decent living wage to the mostly black cafeteria servers, so they went on strike and won. It was the first of many strikes I would see in my time at Chapel Hill, and the first voice of defiance outside of my own head. The seeds of this period started for me when I was just 12 and watching a documentary hosted by Edward R. Murrow called Harvest of Shame. It was an unflinching look at how migrant workers in America lived, and it completely floored me. All of the insulation the suburbs had given me now seemed like a sham. How could I be living like this when those who gathered our food were living like that? Our lifestyle was built on the backs of the hard labor of a class kept in the chains of poverty with little or no conceivable way out. Kids my age were picking fruit. What in the name of fuck was going on here? As I write this, the changes in the system have been so minimal as to be absolutely stupefying. How could my family have so much when these families were lucky just to have clean running water? But that wasn't the only disturbing footage I saw at the time. The television screen would also be filled with black and white images of violence, while peaceful black men and women began to integrate themselves into a white society. I had already begun to look at authority with a rather skeptical eye, and it was only getting worse. It's true that the 60s didn't work, but how could it have? Most of us were just kids, with few real leaders, and the adult population, except for a scant few, was of absolutely no help. They wanted us to stay on track, keep our noses to the grindstone, and wait for them to tell us if there was anything we really needed to worry about. While we waited for our guidance, we got stoned. A lot. In 1964, there was a picture of a being in San Francisco on the cover of Life magazine. It was a fold-out photo with hundreds of thousands of people crowded into Golden Gate Park, all decked out in tie-dyes and bell-bottoms. It signaled that a new age was coming. Things were going to be different, as were we. Years later, I read in a book by Emmett Grogan, a prominent figure in the San Francisco hippie scene, that this had all been staged by the fashion designers of the city to sell their wares to the world. It wasn't even real. It was an advertisement. The 60s were over before they really ever even started. And rightfully so. From the beginning, the 60s were a matter of style over content. That seemed to be the major lesson that we left the world. If you've got style, you don't need content. He who creates the nicest packaging could, dare I say, rule the world. By my junior year, war protests on campus had started to move into full swing. And these weren't the only kind of protests being staged. Black students had seriously begun to question their education at predominantly white universities. and ghettos in major cities were torched out of frustration with an economic system that left little mobility for those in poverty. This, of course, was seen by many as the end of the known universe. There was definitely a schism, and it wasn't just between those who were for the war and those who were against it. It was between those who felt there was a way things always had been done and those who believed there was a way things could be done. Both sides were wrong, both sides were angry, both sides were arrogant. But God, they were breathless, exciting times. I imagine this was the way Hemingway must have felt if he ran with the Bulls. Things were changing. My first year at school, there was a parade down the main street of town, led by a fraternity guy dressed in a Confederate uniform. This was in 1967. The Confederacy had lost the war just over 100 years before, but tradition dies hard in the South. By the following year, that nonsense was dead and buried. No one was going to wear a Confederate uniform on that campus, unless it was Halloween and he wasn't going out that night. As had happened at many other campuses throughout the country, the black students took over the administration building at Duke University to protest the lack of a black studies program. Many of the white students sympathized and gathered in solidarity, hoping to keep the police from taking the students out of the building until their demands were met. This was at a time when segregation was still pretty much the norm in Durham, North Carolina. Jesse Helms, yes, the one who later became senator, owned a television station and came on one night with a gun in his hand and told his viewers that they, too, needed to arm themselves in order to protect their rights. Like I was saying, the fun never stopped. So I went on over to Duke to see my friends Ray and Tom and to find out what was going on. Within a few hours, as darkness fell, the cops made their move, and for the first time I smelled tear gas and felt the power of authority when it doesn't understand what it is up against. I awoke the next morning a different person, as the tear gas still hung in the air over the Duke campus. During the summer of 1968, the fateful and riot-fueled Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. I really wanted to go. I walked out the door of my house, suitcase in hand, prepared to sneak off and do my part to change my country's destiny. Once again, my mother stopped me. "Where do you think you're going?" "Chicago," I replied. "You want to get killed? We can kill you right here at home. It'll save you a trip." So I watched the riots unfold on television in my family's den. That November, Richard Nixon was elected president, and nausea ruled the land. Part of me still blames my mother for that. I wrote my first play during my junior year, and it was worse than awful. I was taking my first class in playwriting, and we were supposed to finish a one-act by the end of the semester. My professor was a well-respected academic who had written texts both on playwriting and technical theater. He was extremely old, but very sharp. As the semester drew to a close, we would read our plays aloud in class. What was wondrous and startling about this exercise was that our professor would always fall asleep while we were reading. You wouldn't be more than a few pages in when he would nod off. And just before you read the last few pages, he would wake up. He did this with everyone, whether it was a good play or not. Then he would give an absolutely insightful interpretation of the work and how to improve it. It was like a magic trick. None of the students ever asked about this habit of his. We just stood in amazement. It wasn't until years later, when I understood the process, that I realized everyone makes pretty much the same mistakes in their first work. And since we had made those very mistakes, He seemed like a genius to us. The guy was always on target. Play in hand, I went to meet with the temporary head of the drama department to see whether he minded if I got a couple of actors to present it in one of the classrooms in the building. He said he really couldn't approve it since he was only the temporary head of the drama department. He explained again that if he were the real head of the department, he would approve it, but his hands were tied. I was prepared for this type of double talk. I had read Catch-22, and my professor sounded exactly like Major, 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 Major. He said that I could do it without approval, but that I would have to deal with any consequences that might arise. And since it didn't seem like anyone could possibly take issue with it, I went ahead and produced, on my own, my very first play. It made me sick. I would tell you what it was about, but it would make you sick too. I stood at the back of the room, facing the wall. Each line of dialogue was like a knife in my back. I spent the whole play quivering as if I had malaria. It's amazing that I ever wrote another. It was not fun. At the end of my junior year, I was approached by a couple of representatives from the Student Senate to run for office for my off-campus district. For the life of me, I don't remember how they knew me, but I will never forget why they asked me to run. My name would be the first one on the ballot, and therefore, if history ran true to form, I would win. It worked. I won. You've got to love democracy in action. I guess I ran because I still had this notion that somehow my presence in the system would make a difference. With a volatile student body, upset by the war and freaked out by the draft, it seemed like an exhilarating time to be involved in student government. Also, students were gaining a larger voice in the way the university was evolving, and that seemed exciting. God, if only this were true. Representative government may be exciting in that British parliamentary way, where everybody is always yelling or crying out something like, "Huzzah, huzzah." But although the Senate of the University of North Carolina was somewhat interesting, it certainly was not exciting. It was a series of routine movements of student funds and activities. But with campuses everywhere poised to strike over the war, there was the occasional debate that added some much-needed drama to the proceedings. The first strike, in October, culminated in a march on Washington. Campuses around the country were brought to a halt as students stopped attending classes. Certainly not a difficult thing for the student body to do. On the day of the strike, one of the more irritating members of our illustrious student government decided that since he found this activity reprehensible, he would punish those on his committee who were striking. He called 3 meetings, and when the striking members didn't show up, they were, by virtue of the Constitution, thrown off the committee and replaced by others who thought the war was just a lovely notion, and anyone who was against it was a raging communist pinko-maggot slut. Well, this truly pissed off the liberal wing. They felt that it was such an abuse of power that the committee chairman should be impeached. His actions certainly angered me to no end. At the very least, I thought, we should yell at him for a couple of hours, just to make sure he understood how big an asshole he was. The liberals approached me and asked if I would be the one to raise the articles of impeachment. I agreed, under the condition that I didn't have to be the one to conduct the legal proceedings that would follow. No problem, I was told. There would be others who would handle that. Perfect. Let's get the prick, I said. Yeah, let's get the prick. Well, it would have been nice if any of us had read the Constitution. I should have known that these guys were as lazy as I was. And if they were really that lazy, then why weren't they glad to be thrown off the committee? So now I was stuck as the lawyer for the impeachment process. I have never had any interest in the law. That and medicine left me cold. And I am just thrilled that there are people who want to do that shit. I couldn't really get myself to focus on the task at hand, and I certainly didn't know how to express myself in my role as prosecutor. Meanwhile, my worthy opponent was in law school and knew his shit. It did nothing but frustrate and irritate me. So after an inept attempt at actually trying to work within the system, I was pissed off at both sides. I was embarrassed by my own incompetence and didn't have enough orifices for all the ways these idiots were screwing me. At that point, I'd had enough. I told them that I wasn't going to be a whipping boy for their stupidity and walked out of the chambers, never to seek another elected office anywhere again. I also wrote my first full-length play during that year, a musical no less. I didn't write the music. It was written by my friend Cary Engelberg. He was attending George Washington University, and they were opening a new theater there. We called the musical, Do You Know Where Your Children Are? The title was based on a familiar refrain played constantly on television. It's 11 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? It was about our lives growing up in the suburbs, with a lot of artistic license and embellishments. The set was a model of a DNA helix, which seemed very profound at the time. Cary wrote some great music, and we had a few laughs here and there. But the play ran 2.5 hours without an intermission. Instinctively, I think we knew that if we gave the audience a chance to leave, they would run like hell, which is exactly what Cary did. While I had definitely been bitten by the theater bug, which would prove to be a perfect profession for an obsessive-compulsive personality like mine, he turned his back on the theater and is now a doctor of note at the University of Michigan, where he specializes in infectious diseases. What a waste. In a world desperately in need of bad theater, I'll never understand why Cary is throwing his life away helping sick people. Hey, some people have to learn from their own mistakes. The final strike. 4 dead in Ohio. Toward the end of the school year, Nixon began bombing Cambodia, which did not sit well with America's already angry students. Enough was enough. Campuses erupted with protests. At Kent State, as we all now know too well, there was a protest that ended in the death of 4 students at the hands of National Guardsmen. What they were doing with live ammunition is beyond me. Many conspiracy theorists opined that the killing of these students was a strategy of the government to keep us in line, that somehow we had it coming to us. I doubt it. The government is never that smart, and thinking isn't their strong suit. At the time, many of us felt that Nixon and the creeps with whom he had surrounded himself were thrilled about what had happened. It was the last straw. With just a few weeks to go until exams, campus after campus went on strike. There were those in school who supported the war, and they no doubt felt that we were striking so we wouldn't have to take exams. I consider that a lot of bullshit. Although, as a senior, it was nice not to have to worry about those last few days of tests. Besides, there were other things on my mind. It was spring, a time of rebirth and wonder. I was in the very heart of my youth, and my country was bombing the snot out of a tiny little country in Southeast Asia, and there, but for the grace of God, I could have been lying in a pool of blood. It made me want to do something. As dumb as shutting down a college is, it was at least something. It was the only tool we had, and we used it. I wanted to help, so I approached a few members of the strike mobilization committee to find out how I could take a more active part in what was going on. Since there wasn't much I could do at my campus, I came up with a brilliant idea. I got permission to go over and help organize the women's campus at Greensboro, since they had not, as of yet, joined in the strike. I know what you're thinking, and you're right. Volunteering served a dual purpose. I could help the young women at UNCG see the error of their ways, and I could also help them err in their ways. Rarely is one presented with the opportunity to satisfy both one's moral and immoral convictions simultaneously. Let it be known, I wasn't successful on either count. The girls never went on strike, and I struck out. Maybe, if I had done my job properly, the age of Aquarius would still be upon us. One thing is for sure. At UNC, we really knew how to party. The 3-day music festival, Jubilee, was the final campus blowout of the year. The event was so spectacular, it should have been called Juba-fucking-lee. It was of epic proportions, with the best entertainment imaginable. During my time there, they managed to gather some of the best musical acts playing at the time. All of the bands at the peak of their popularity. Acts like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and the Allman Brothers. In my senior year alone, we had Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen, James Taylor, B.B. King, and Grand Funk Railroad. James Taylor's first album had just been released that spring. He was from Chapel Hill, and his dad headed up the medical school. And when he sang Carolina in My Mind, we all went nuts, screaming at each other as our fevered, pot-addled minds hoped to grasp the entire depth of what this song meant. In the end, it meant nothing, but it was pretty fucking awesome at the time. And when you were in Carolina, listening to James, you actually see the fire and rain. Then there was Grand Funk Railroad, a group that had a very limited shelf life. They didn't survive the 60s. As they say, I guess you had to be there. They managed to nail down the simplest chords and driving drums to keep any stone soul delighted and amused. Maybe it was the joy of monotony, but at the time there was no one like them. The true star of the weekend was Joe Cocker and his Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, featuring a cast of soon-to-be all-star performers, Rita Coolidge, Leon Russell, the Shelter Horns, to name but a few. My friends Ed and Cliff had come down for the weekend, and Tom and Ray had come over from Duke. Ray's girlfriend, Jerry, had gotten some of her sorority sisters from Duke to come as our friends' dates. And we all gathered at the place I was sharing with Don, who had transferred from the University of Maryland. I had the bright idea to bake up some pot brownies, having never experimented with the herb in that fashion. Only there was one problem: no brownie mix. I guess there had been a rush on it that weekend. There wasn't even any chocolate pudding. Hell-bent on experimenting, I bought vanilla pudding. I soon discovered that there are a couple of problems with using vanilla. First, it does an awful job of masking the flavor of grass and makes for a truly lousy presentation. Compound this with the fact that I didn't remove the stems and seeds from the pot, and, well, voila, a bowl of baby puke. If Martha Stewart had been around, she would have had an aneurysm. I can still remember the sour looks on the sorority girls' faces as we left to go to the concert. Ray and I got into his car with Jerry and my girlfriend at the time, Cindy Champion. How great a name is that? They weren't really upset because they were used to this kind of nonsense from us. We backed the car up and pulled out of the parking lot. Ray and I chattered away about how bad my experiment tasted, but that it felt pretty nice. And I apologized up and down to Jerry for screwing things up for her friends. We'd been driving for a while when Jerry leaned over to Ray and pointed out that we weren't moving. She thought the back wheels were in a ditch or something. Ray and I looked out the window, looked back at each other, and then looked back out the window. Then we both had one of those laughs that goes on for so long that it ends with tears. Tears of stupid joy, mind you, not of judgmental recrimination. We both thought we were moving. So much for the concept of pot and safe driving. It made for a hell of a concert, though, I can tell you that. My senior year at Chapel Hill, I made the decision that if I wasn't going to have a relationship, I was going to have a dog. My parents never let us have one because my father was afraid of them. So we had parakeets, which are nice if you want to teach your children about death. Our first parakeet was old when we got him, so not only was he senile, he was also very mean. The others lasted a few months, until they either flew into a mirror or ate the plastic toys that littered the bottom of the tray. A kind of parakeet suicide, I believe. I had always wanted a dog, and it seemed like the perfect time to get one. Who knows, I thought. The dog might even lead me into a relationship. He's not that cute, but he's got a cute dog, and 1 out of 2 ain't bad. A friend of mine mentioned that there was a woman in Greensboro, North Carolina, who had a kennel. It was packed with more than 60 dogs, and they were all named after the Kennedys. Her husband had given her an ultimatum, and she had to start giving the dogs away. There was Teddy and Robert and Jackie and Caroline and Rose, to name but a few, and I got a 6-month-old Cocker Terrier named John John. The first thing I tried to do was change his name. I didn't want to be standing around the middle of campus yelling, "John John! John John!" I wanted a tougher name for a little dog like that. But he wasn't having it. That's the name he responded to, and that's the way he wanted it. This was a dog of inordinate intelligence, and he didn't have time for my bullshit. He was the sort of dog that looked in your eyes with a kind of wistfulness, as if to say, "Gee, it's sad you're not as evolved as I am." And I probably wasn't, as I was just a college kid. It took him a couple of days to be house-trained, and shortly after that, he didn't even need a leash. There were no leash laws in Chapel Hill at the time. Wonder what the PETA people think about that. And he liked to walk right next to me. A few weeks later, we were walking home, and he darted into the middle of the street. A car ran right over him, and luckily did not hit him, but it obviously scared the ever-loving shit out of him. He never left the sidewalk again, and would always stand at a corner and wait for the light before he'd cross the street. He socialized himself faster than I did when I was a child. John John would go to class with me, and when the professor got boring, he would split and wait outside for me. As he got to know my friends, he would follow them around while I was in class, or he'd go and wait for me at one of their houses. If I was in a restaurant and he saw friends of mine walk by, he'd run outside and walk them to the corner and then come back to the restaurant. Within just a few months, he always knew how to find me or knew where to go so that I could find him. I went to Duke with him one night to see a girl there. I left him outside the dormitory, and when I came out a few hours later, he was gone. I waited, but he never showed up. I searched, but couldn't find him. The next evening, he showed up at the dorm at exactly the same time I had brought him there the night before. He was an amazing animal who never ceased to astound me. It was as if he had trained me. I was lucky to have an animal like that as my owner. New Haven. After graduation, I made the decision with my friends Tom, Cliff, and Ed to spend the summer months in New Haven, Connecticut. All right, folks, here's a tip. I don't know much. I act like I do, but I don't really. One thing I do know is that whenever you have vacation time of any sort, one of the last places you should consider going is New Haven, Connecticut. Despite the fact that it's the home of Yale University, it is truly one of the uglier places on the face of the earth. It has to be really, really sunny for it not to seem gray. But, to its credit, the city does offer a good submarine sandwich and a rather nice burger. But you can get that stuff in much nicer places. The biggest problem with New Haven is that there is more gravity there. I have seen this in only one other city, Greensboro, North Carolina. The pull of gravity is such that you never really feel good. You always feel weighted down and depressed. Yale University sat in the midst of an economically depressed neighborhood, which gave it the feel of living in feudal England. There was a small community of activists who had gathered in this part of town and had started up such things as a food co-op, an automobile shop, and a soup kitchen. The whole community wasn't making enough money to shop at the supermarket, so we went to the co-op where for $1 you could get a delightful meal of brown rice, vegetables, and salad. Just the memory of it makes me want to go to the bathroom. New Haven at that time was a focal point for radical activity because it was the home of the Bobby Seale trial. There was a small Black Panthers contingent living on the outskirts of Yale University, and they were extremely militant because they were tired of the black community being screwed. Militant is actually kind of a shitty word for them. These guys were not a very happy lot. Bobby Seale was the Minister of Information for the party, and even the president of Yale, Kingman Brewster Jr., had said that he didn't think Seale would get a fair trial in New Haven, a statement that certainly riled up mainstream America. The Panther headquarters was located downtown, and it seemed the police would harass them on a weekly basis. So Cliff, Ed, Tom, and me, and a number of other very white, very middle-class kids took action. To show our solidarity and feed our collective paranoia, we would form a human barricade in front of their headquarters just in case the police arrived. And the Panthers would always come out and yell at us. In retrospect, I can understand their reaction. It must have been really insulting to them that a bunch of long-haired hippie white kids had appointed themselves protection for the toughest black militants this country had ever seen. They probably thought we were merely playing at revolution. We weren't. We were just doing what we could. The reason we decided to spend the summer in New Haven was that my friend Ed had gone to Yale and met some people who were putting together a new endeavor. It was something so idealistic that we must have been completely out of our minds. Even as I write this, I'm shaking my head in disbelief, especially since we now live in a world where liberal is a dirty word. We actually wanted to write and publish a left-wing Reader's Digest. What's that, Lewis, you ask? A misdirection of optimism, that's for sure. The idea behind it was that if we could appeal with simple intelligence to the American people about the war, civil rights, and economic justice, we could change their minds. To put it another way, we were hoping to update the paintings of Norman Rockwell by expressing our beliefs in a non-confrontational fashion. We would write about our common concerns and interview people who would appeal to middle America. Yep, obviously we were nuttier than fruitcakes, But we were just putting our money where our mouths were. And even though I had a fellowship in playwriting in the offing, I was hoping my involvement in this venture would lead me out of theater where I still wasn't sure I belonged. I was looking for one more shot at being a part of society, albeit at its fringes, and avoiding outpatient clinics. We lived in the basement of an art supply storefront. There was no kitchen, and we slept on mattresses on the floor. The reason we lived like that was because we were broke. But these kinds of conditions do give you the sense that you're doing something important, perhaps because they don't really pay people to do really important things. And we certainly weren't getting paid. We were doing all of this on spec. My first and only job on the magazine was to interview General Shoup, who had served in Vietnam and later declared the war unwinnable. He felt that we were making a huge mistake and it had to stop. According to General Shoup, we were fighting a group of people who were trying to unite their country and were sick of being under the thumb of a foreign power. I spent 3 or 4 hours with the stately gentleman who had served his country for 40 or more years, and he made it quite clear to me that the course we had taken in Vietnam was madness. He told the story in a way that all those reading our version of Reader's Digest could understand. Too bad it was never printed. As the summer unfolded, it became quite obvious that we were not going to be able to pull off this magazine. The man who was funding it left town to search for his guru, like so many others at that time. For many of my generation, the path to enlightenment started with drugs and ended with gurus. I didn't quite understand how one followed the other, but meditation was becoming the next big thing. It seems to work for millions of people, so who am I to argue? Still, I figure you can close your eyes and listen to your own breath, or you can close your eyes and touch yourself. Either way, you're going to end up in the same blissful state. When the magazine endeavor failed, it dawned on us that we weren't going to get paid. Even in the face of destitution, we felt that it was important to finish the project. My friends are good that way. Also, there was a big rock festival coming up in Powder Ridge that we didn't want to miss. It was that kind of priority that had kept us going through the summer. Between being broke and living on the edge of dysentery from a bad vegetarian diet, the concert was our light at the end of the tunnel. We were absolutely ecstatic the night of the festival. We had armed ourselves with a balanced diet of LSD, marijuana, and Boone's Farm apple wine. For those of you who have never experienced the quality of nausea brought on by a bottle of Boone's Farm, suffice it to say, it was the wine cooler of the 60s. Cocktails in tow, we made our way to Powder Ridge, a dopey little ski resort not far from New Haven. The crowd was huge, and it was grand. We hadn't really seen many people that summer. And there were women there. We hadn't been seeing them at all. The main artist playing that evening was a group called Rhinoceros. The band was kind of like the low-rent Fish of its time, or a Grateful Dead that didn't quite make the grade. It didn't matter to us. It could have been a bad bar mitzvah band for all we cared. We were just thrilled to be out and about. Once we had settled in on the hillside, it was time to take the LSD. My first trip had been an obvious horror show, and I wasn't going to let that happen again. I had brought John the dog with me, and I felt that since he was living at a higher level than I was, he would watch over me and fend off any evil, bad vibrations, or juju that might be in the area. He would keep a safe circle around me. Chances are anyone who has thoughts as crazy as these before taking acid won't get any crazier. We'd just taken our LSD when it was announced that they needed folks to come down and help out with the parking. And we would get armbands. After a summer of feeling completely disenfranchised, we were about to become the man, or at least a very special adult safety patrol. And maybe we would even meet some ladies. And even if we didn't, we would still have the armbands. Our assignment was simple. All we had to do was make sure the cars entering the parking lot took a left. If they took a right, they would end up stuck on a hillside and they'd need tow trucks to get them out. That was it. That was all we had to do. So we stood out there for a while, armbands akimbo, informing all that passed by to turn left. The sun began to set slowly, and it was becoming more beautiful every millisecond. Now, beauty is always relative. On LSD, a beautiful sunset is not only a beautiful sunset. It is the beginning and the end of time as we know it. It is emblematic of all that is wondrous in nature. It is all of the joyousness of humanity expressed in the sky. It is how we are all connected to everything, and everything is connected to everything else. It simply becomes a symphony unto itself, and the colors stagger you, and you can't find the words to express all that you are feeling. Again, maybe you had to be there. Anyway, we decided we needed to sit down in order to truly appreciate a sunset of that magnitude. We had to talk about the sunset and what it meant to us, and what a summer it had been, even though things had gone bad. And weren't these the best armbands ever? It was like, well, in the ads they call it Miller time. But this was Miller time in another dimension and in Technicolor, and without the smell of stale beer and urine hanging in the air. We talked and talked and talked about our hopes and dreams and visions of the future. Our reverie was disturbed by a cacophony of voices yelling and screaming. Night was now upon us, and when we rose to see what the commotion was all about, we noticed that some cars had taken a right instead of a left, and were now stuck on the hill. Oh, shit. We'd forgotten all about our job. So we took off our armbands, threw them under the nearest car, and walked slowly back to the hillside. It was exactly what every responsible drug user would have done. The rock concert began, and it was absolutely wonderful. Well, anything would have been absolutely wonderful that night. Between the LSD and the complete lack of any stimulus other than politics for more than 2 months, we were riding in high gear. It was a night of pure and simple avoidance. We avoided thinking about the fact that we were now out of college, and what the fuck were we going to do on the heels of our failed venture. So we partied like there was no tomorrow. It was Boone's Farm for everybody. The band took a short break, and I walked down the hill with John to check things out. I went over to the Bummer Tent, a true product of the 60s. The tent was set up for those people who took drugs and weren't having a very good time of it. Now, most of the time, you couldn't be too sure of the quality of the drug, although in my experience, the stuff was always of a very high quality, because back then, we didn't have business majors peddling lower quality stuff in an effort to increase profits. In the 60s, there was no such thing as a business major. Business majors began to blossom in the 80s, and there's something profoundly stupid about the whole concept. There are just too many kinds of businesses to possibly major in all of them. For instance, there's the business of selling chairs, and there's the completely different business of making chairs. The only thing they have in common is the need for an accountant. Well, back when I was in school, people didn't major in business. They majored in chemistry because chemistry was big back then. And what did they do with their chemistry degrees? They made drugs for the rest of us. As a result, there was a lot of quality control because the chemists who were making the drugs wanted to take them too. Besides, it would have been tough to give someone a bad drug because they knew you and would then beat the crap out of you. But even if the drug was good, it was impossible to tell what someone's reaction to it would be, and so the bummer tent came into being. A person could go to the tent and talk to a doctor or to other folks who had taken drugs before and understood the cul-de-sacs people might find themselves in. So I went over to the tent as an observer, because now that I was having such a good trip, I thought John and I could help these poor folks out. John was obviously a huge help to me at this point. Maybe I could get him to share his expertise with others. There wasn't too much action in the tent, but I sat down and listened to a conversation between a few Californians who'd helped organize the event and a group of the more prominent leaders of our tiny New Haven community. They were arguing over whether a Black Panther should speak to the crowd. The New Haven group didn't think it was a very good idea, but the more progressive West Coasters enjoyed combining their drugs, rock and roll, and politics all in one big cauldron. I had no interest in mixing all that stuff up. It would be like mixing cheap tequila shots with elevator music and a Dr. Phil lecture. As I listened to this conversation, I thought, wow, these guys are only a couple of years older than me. And if these are the people in charge, we are completely and utterly fucked. No wonder we're not getting anywhere. There are no adults in the room. It was finally decided that the Black Panther should speak. This was going to be good. I headed back to find my friends to wait for the disaster to unfold. By the time I found them, the Black Panther had begun to speak. As he yelled at us for doing drugs, you could hear thunder in the distance, and heat lightning began to flash across the sky. It was the kind of thing that you see in your head when you listen to In the Hall of the Mountain King. This really didn't help his cause. Under the influence of drugs, the crowd sensed that the Black Panther was causing the storm. It had been so nice out when the rock and roll was playing, and now it felt like there was something malevolent in the air. This really sent the kids into a tailspin, and the more he spoke, the more kids started heading down the hill toward the bummer tent. John, I am happy to report, kept my circle of safety intact. As the speech drew to a conclusion, he started to tell us that if we really cared about our community, we should get a gun and use it against the pigs. He suggested we should start by going after whoever was in charge of parking. To be honest, I'm not sure if the last part actually happened or if it was just in my head. What I am confident about is that it started to drizzle and the concert was ruined. It was yet another bad night in our desperate attempt to establish a new kind of American community. We left New Haven shortly thereafter. It was a summer that I would always remember, but it was a summer that I never wanted to relive. We were a little older, a little wiser, and a little more disillusioned. It is precisely at this point in writing the book that my laptop broke down on me in a hotel room in Madison, Wisconsin. It didn't just break down, it dropped dead. The amazing thing about computers is that they are magical, especially if you don't know shit about how they work. They're really wonderful pieces of equipment, and when they don't work, you realize just how much you need them, and just how unnecessary they truly are. I would have actually written this book with a pencil if I didn't have something called a deadline. Maybe that's why the computer broke down, just to say to me, why don't you take that pencil and shove it up your ass? Yeah, I may be unnecessary, but you desperately need me. So, my computer is now lying dead in front of me. The computer is less than a year old. So, I guess this would be considered crib death. Now, if they are going to make these machines so that they die within a year, and it's supposed to be a disposable kind of thing, then they should just tell us. Don't put a warranty on it.